The wine cup is in your hands. You have held it 1,000 times before. Same weight, same silver rim, same pour. Your hands are steady. They have always been steady. That is why you are still alive. But tonight is different. Tonight a child handed you a tablet 20 minutes ago. A boy named Commodus, the emperor's favorite servant, found it lying on a table and picked it up without understanding what it was. He brought it to you because you were nearby, because you were always nearby, because for 10 years you have been the woman who stands closest to the most dangerous man in the world. You read the names on that tablet. Your name was first. You have perhaps 15 minutes before the emperor steps out of his bath. When he does, he will look at your face. He has spent 12 years studying faces. He knows what fear looks like. He knows what guilt looks like. He knows what it means when a person is holding something back. If he sees it in your eyes tonight, you will not survive until morning. So you stand here in the corridor of the imperial palace of Rome on the last night of the year 192 AD, and you make a decision that will change the history of the world. But to understand why you made it, you need to understand the man in that bath. You need to go back to the beginning, not to the arena, not to the senators screaming his name, not to the blood on the marble floors. You need to go back to a boy, 11 years old, standing beside a bath that was not hot enough. His name was Lucius Aurelius Commodus Antoninus. His father was Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, the most respected man in the known world. His mother was Faustina, the younger daughter of an emperor, wife of an emperor, a woman whose name would echo through Roman history. The boy was born in 161 AD in Lanuvium, and from the moment he could walk, he walked through corridors of marble and gold. Slaves bowed before he spoke. Soldiers stepped aside when he passed. The entire apparatus of the greatest empire the world had ever known bent itself around this child as if his comfort was the organizing principle of civilization. On an ordinary afternoon, the boy stepped into his bath. The water was not hot enough. Any child might complain. This child gave an order. The servant responsible was to be thrown alive into the furnace that heated the water. The servants standing in that corridor looked at each other. The boy did not yet have legal authority to execute anyone. His father was still emperor. His word was not yet law. But they also understood something that the history books would later confirm with a century of blood. One day this boy would have the authority. One day there would be no one to contradict him. And the man who refused the order of a future emperor on a Tuesday afternoon might find himself remembered on a Wednesday morning. So they improvised. They took lambskins from a nearby room and threw them into the furnace. The wool caught fire immediately. The fat crackled and spit. The smell of scorched flesh filled the corridor and drifted toward the bath chamber. The boy was still in the water. He paused. He tilted his head slightly the way a person does when they are listening for confirmation of something they expected to hear. He smelled it, and he nodded to himself slowly with a particular satisfaction of a person who has given an order and received results, and he sank deeper into the bath. He believed a man had just died screaming in a furnace because the water was lukewarm, and the only thing he felt was that the problem had been handled correctly. The servants in that corridor had just made a decision they thought was merciful. They had saved a man's life. They had protected an innocent person from a child's cruelty. What they could not understand in that moment was that they had done something far more consequential. They had taught the boy that his orders produced results, that when he wanted something done, it was done, that the world around him would arrange itself to match his expectations regardless of what those expectations required of other human beings. They did not save a man's life that afternoon. They built a monster. This is the story that Cassius Dio, who lived through the reign that followed, who sat in the front row of the Colosseum and watched with his own eyes, chose to record. Not as an anecdote, as an explanation, because Dio understood something that modern historians sometimes overlook. The cruelty of Commodus was not something that developed gradually, was not the product of years of corruption and absolute power warping an otherwise normal mind. The cruelty was already there, fully formed on that afternoon beside the lukewarm bath. What the years of absolute power did was not create it. They simply removed every obstacle standing between it and the world. Marcus Aurelius knew this. He had spent his life writing about discipline, about the mastery of one's impulses, about the gap between what a man wants to do and what a man chooses to do. The Meditations, his private journal, his record of a lifetime of effort to become better than his instincts were, the product of a man who understood that virtue was not given. It was built daily through resistance and reflection and the willingness to choose the harder path. He hired the greatest philosophers in the empire to educate his son. He brought rhetoricians and mathematicians and Stoic teachers into the palace. He took the boy on military campaigns along the Danube, hoping that the weight of real responsibility, the reality of decisions that cost lives, would press something useful into the boy's character. Cassius Dio recorded with the plainness of a man who had run out of polite ways to say something devastating that only one thing prevented Marcus Aurelius from being completely happy: that after educating his son in the best possible way, he was deeply disappointed in him. One thing: the entire philosophical achievement of one of history's greatest minds, the wars won, the provinces governed, the empire held together through plague and invasion and economic crisis, and the single shadow across all of it was this boy. But Marcus Aurelius did not remove Commodus from the succession. This is the fact that historians have wrestled with for centuries, and it is important to understand why, because it is not a simple failure of judgment. It is a rational decision made by a brilliant man under genuine constraint. Rome in the 170s was not a stable place. The Antonine Plague had moved through the empire like a slow fire, killing somewhere between 5 and 10 million people over 2 decades. Wars on the Danube frontier were consuming soldiers and treasury at a rate that left no margin for internal disruption. The empire needed above everything else clarity about succession. A clear heir meant a peaceful transition. A disputed succession meant civil war, and civil war in the condition Rome was in during the 100s and 70s could break the empire permanently. Commodus was the biological son. He was the heir everyone recognized. To remove him and name someone else, even someone vastly more qualified, would invite exactly the kind of factional violence that Marcus Aurelius had spent his reign trying to prevent. So he made a calculation. He decided that the stability of a clear succession mattered more than the character of the successor. He kept his son in the line and kept writing the Meditations, and kept hoping that the weight of the future would press something useful into the boy. It was the most consequential mistake of his life. When Marcus Aurelius died in March of 180 AD at the military camp near the Danube, his son was 18 years old and had been co-emperor for 3 years. Within weeks, Commodus did what his father had refused to do for a decade. He made peace with the Germanic tribes and returned to Rome. The generals were furious. The peace was seen as a betrayal of everything Marcus Aurelius had fought for in his final years. But Commodus was not interested in the Danube frontier. He was not interested in governing provinces or managing the treasury or holding the borders against the pressure that was building on every edge of the empire. He was interested in Rome itself, in its crowds, in the Colosseum, in being watched. He did not want to rule Rome. He wanted Rome to worship him. It was around 182 AD that a woman named Marcia entered the imperial palace. The historical record is not precise about her origins. She was freeborn, but without significant social standing. She had come to the attention of a man named Quadratus, a wealthy Roman, and through the connections that wealthy Romans maintained, she eventually arrived within the orbit of the imperial household. She was young, dark-eyed, and possessed of a quality that is very difficult to define and very easy to recognize. She watched. While other women in the palace talked or performed or worked to attract attention, Marcia watched. She observed every room she entered. She noted who stood where, who spoke to whom, what the emperor's mood was when he arrived, what made his expression shift from satisfaction to danger. She was from her first days in the palace building a map, not of the corridors and rooms, though she came to know those too, a map of the human landscape, of who was dangerous, who was useful, who could be trusted for exactly one thing and nothing more. She understood within her first weeks that this was not a place where safety was given. It was a place where safety was constructed quietly, methodically, one small decision at a time, with no margin for error, and no one to appeal to if the construction failed. She watched the emperor closely. He did not read reports. His advisors brought him documents and he waved them away. He did not attend the meetings of his council with any regularity. He did not walk the military inspections or review the treasury accounts. What he did was spend his mornings in the baths, his afternoons practicing in the arena with his trainers, and his evenings in the banquet halls surrounded by the 600 people who had been assembled for his use. 300 women, 300 young men, drawn from every level of Roman society. Senators' wives standing next to women pulled from the streets. All distinctions erased. All of them in the architecture of the palace the same. The man who actually ran the empire during these years was not Commodus. It was Perennis, the Praetorian prefect he had inherited from his father's reign, a capable administrator who kept the machinery of governance turning while the emperor devoted himself to the arena. The senators grumbled among themselves in whispers behind closed doors that Rome was being governed by a servant while the master amused himself. But the empire functioned. The grain kept flowing. The borders held. The roads were maintained. And Commodus, satisfied that the world was arranging itself correctly around him, devoted himself entirely to becoming what he had always believed he was, a god. But before the arena consumed everything, something else happened first. Something that would shatter whatever remained of Commodus's capacity for trust and transform a man who was cruel by nature into a man who was actively, systematically, and permanently dangerous to everyone around him. In 182 AD, his sister Lucilla sent a man to kill him. Lucilla was the eldest surviving child of Marcus Aurelius. She had been empress herself, once wife of the co-emperor Lucius Verus, and she had lived inside the machinery of Roman imperial power long enough to understand exactly what she was watching unfold under her brother's reign. She was not a reckless woman. She was not acting from personal grievance alone, though personal grievance was present. She had gathered around her a network of senators and officials who shared her assessment that the reign of Commodus was not merely incompetent, but actively destructive, and that the longer it continued, the less of Rome there would be left to save. The plan was simple. Strike fast, strike silent, and it would be over before the Praetorian Guard could respond. But the man she chose made a mistake that undid everything. He was in the Colosseum in a narrow corridor through which Commodus was passing with the dagger ready in the moment available. Instead of moving immediately, he stopped. He raised the weapon. And then, for reasons that Cassius Dio recorded with the barely contained disbelief of a man who has read this detail 100 times and cannot quite accept it, the assassin spoke. He said, "This is what the Senate sends to you." Those words gave the Praetorian guards 3 seconds. 3 seconds was enough. They were on him before the dagger reached its target. The moment was gone. What Lucilla had not understood, and what Marcia understood immediately when she heard what had happened, was the specific nature of the failure. It was not a failure of courage. The assassin had gone to the Colosseum with genuine intent. It was a failure of discipline. He had wanted the emperor to know who was killing him and why. He had wanted the moment to be witnessed, to be understood, to carry a message. That desire, that need for the act to mean something beyond the act itself, had cost him the half-second that was the difference between success and catastrophe. Marcia filed this observation in the part of her mind where she kept the things that mattered. Lucilla was arrested immediately. She was sent to Capri, the island off the Bay of Naples that Roman emperors had used for generations as a place to put people they wanted to forget without the inconvenience of a public execution. Months later, an imperial guard arrived on the island, carrying orders from the emperor. Lucilla, who had been empress of Rome, who had been raised by the greatest philosopher emperor in history, who had devoted the final years of her life to an attempt to save the empire her father had spent his life building, died alone on that island. She was around 33 years old. But Commodus was not finished. The Historia Augusta records what came next in language that is careful precisely because what it is describing resists straightforward description. After Lucilla's death, Commodus turned to his remaining sisters, the other daughters of Marcus Aurelius women, who had been raised by philosophers and educated as imperial women, women of blood and history and genuine dignity, and he degraded them. The historians use that word with the specific economy of people who know they are recording something that does not need elaboration to land with full force. He corrupted them. This was not impulsive cruelty. This was calculated. A message delivered through the bodies of his own family to every person in Rome who might be watching and thinking. There is no bond I will not break. There is no line I will not cross. If I will do this to the daughters of Marcus Aurelius, to the women who share my blood and my name and my history, then spend no time imagining what I would be willing to do to you. He then took a concubine and named her Faustina. After his mother, this detail marks a boundary. the deliberate blurring of every category that separates a functioning human mind from something else entirely. He was not simply cruel, he was systematically dismantling the distinctions by which the people around him organized their understanding of what was possible and what was not. Marcia watched all of this from the position she had built for herself inside the palace. She had been in this building long enough to understand that proximity to this man was the most dangerous position in the empire, and simultaneously the only position from which anything could eventually be done. She noted the guards who served under Laertius, the praetorian prefect, who had replaced Perennis after the latter's execution in 185 AD. She studied the rhythm of the emperor's days, the habits he repeated without variation, the single ritual he never skipped. After his bath each evening he drank. Same cup, same pour, same hands delivering it. She kept something hidden, a small thing obtained quietly over years kept in a place no one thought to look. She hoped she would never need it. She suspected she would. It was also in these years that Marcia first observed Narcissus. He was a wrestler, broad-shouldered and quiet, brought into the imperial household as a training partner for the emperor's arena preparation. Every morning in the practice chambers below the main palace wing, Narcissus worked with Commodus through the routines that preceded the performances in the Colosseum. He knew the emperor's body with the precise knowledge of a man who had spent years in physical proximity to it. He knew where the strength was concentrated, how the balance shifted during fatigue, what Commodus looked like when he was genuinely tired versus when he was performing tiredness for an audience. Marcia noticed over the months and then years of watching these sessions from the periphery that Narcissus had learned to make himself invisible in the way that only people with very good survival instincts learn to do. He showed exactly as much as was required and nothing more. He won the practice bouts when losing would have produced dangerous consequences and lost them when winning would have produced worse ones. He had, in the compressed moral universe of the imperial palace, become an expert in the navigation of a reality governed entirely by the moods of one unpredictable man. She also noticed that something had changed in him over the years. There was a quality in his face during certain moments in those practice chambers when the emperor's behavior crossed a particular line and the other people present dropped their eyes, and Narcissus did not that she recognized because she had felt it in herself. It was not quite disgust and not quite fear. It was the expression of a person who is calculating something very specific and has not yet arrived at an answer they can act on. She stored this observation alongside the others. Meanwhile, the empire was deteriorating in ways that the grain supply and border reports recorded with the neutral precision of administrative documents that do not know they are describing a civilization in trouble. In 185 AD, Perennis, the man who had actually been governing Rome while Commodus performed in the arena, was accused of plotting against the emperor. Whether the accusation was true, it is not established by any source that has survived. What is clear is that Commodus believed it or found it useful to believe it, and Perennis was executed. With him went the last person in the imperial administration who had both the authority and the capability to keep the machinery of empire running at anything approaching functional capacity. Laertius was appointed praetorian prefect in the period that followed. He was a different kind of man than Perennis. Where Perennis had been primarily an administrator, Laertius was primarily a political intelligence, a man who understood power and its distribution and the gap between what institutions claimed to do and what they actually did. He had taken the position with clear eyes about what it required of him, which was to serve an emperor. He assessed as destructive and to carry out orders he found increasingly difficult to justify with any framework that reflected his actual values. He served because the alternative was not retirement. In the palace of Commodus, the alternative was the execution list. What replaced Perennis in the administrative role was a man named Cleander, more corrupt and less competent, who managed Rome's grain supply with such negligence that by 190 AD a shortage in the city nearly produced a full rebellion. Cleander was eventually torn apart by a mob in the streets. His successor was no better. The empire was being administered by a succession of men who were improvising around a structural absence because the man at the top had removed himself entirely from governance and was spending his days in the arena and his nights in arrangements that the historical sources describe with careful vagueness. Marcia turned this fact over in her mind during those years. An empire could survive an absent emperor. Rome had done it before. What it could not survive indefinitely was an emperor who was absent and simultaneously destroying the people capable of filling the gap he had created. The arena in these years became the defining institution of Roman public life in a way that no one who had known the city under Marcus Aurelius could have anticipated. Commodus had constructed for himself a role that no emperor before him had claimed. He was not the patron of the gladiatorial games, the political figure who attended and sponsored the spectacles from a seat of honor. He was a participant. He fought in the Colosseum himself personally before crowds of 50,000 people, over 700 times across the full span of his reign. Every fight was arranged in advance. His opponents were given wooden weapons or no weapons at all. Some were drugged before they entered the arena. Some were chained. Commodus fought with real steel against men who had been prepared to lose, and he won every time. And the sound of 50,000 voices filling the Colosseum was to this man the nearest approximation of religious experience that the physical world could provide. He charged the government 1 million sesterces for each appearance, 700 million sesterces in total, drawn from an imperial treasury already strained by wars and plague and the mismanagement of the years since Perennis. An empire that could not adequately supply its frontier legions was paying its emperor 700 million sesterces to watch him beat opponents who had been crippled before they entered the ring. But the money was secondary. What the arena really was in the political architecture of the reign was a machine for producing a specific kind of submission. Attendance was mandatory. Every senator, every general of significance, the men who had commanded armies and governed provinces of millions and built the administrative structure that had held the empire together through plague and invasion. They sat in the front rows of the Colosseum, their togas pressed, their expressions arranged with desperate care, and they chanted, not cheered, chanted. Cassius Dio recorded the exact words because he was there, because he sat in those front rows himself and his mouth moved with the rest, and because he understood that the specific words were the point. The phrase was rehearsed and mandatory and repeated at prescribed intervals during the emperor's performances. You are Lord, you are first of all men, most fortunate. You win and you will win. From time everlasting Amazonian, you win. Consider what that means in full. You are a senator of Rome. You have spent 4 decades building a career in law and governance. You have commanded legions. You have stood in the Senate House and debated the direction of the greatest empire in history. You carry in your memory the idea of the Republic, the principle, however imperfectly realized, that Rome was governed collectively with rules and precedents, and a shared acknowledgement that no single man should hold unlimited power over everyone else. And you are sitting in the front row of the Colosseum, your voice cracking from repetition, sweat running down the back of your neck, screaming praise at a man who is beating a chain-drugged, weaponless opponent with a real sword while his opponent holds a piece of wood, and the performance is being called gladiatorial combat. And you know with absolute certainty that if the emperor glances over and your mouth is not moving, if your enthusiasm does not appear sufficiently genuine for the moment, your name will be noted. And names that get noted do not survive the following week. This happened 700 times over 12 years. And this is where the question that every person who encounters this history eventually arrives at becomes unavoidable. Why did no one stop him? Why did the Senate not act collectively? Why did the generals not march? Why did the Praetorian Guard not simply refuse on some ordinary morning to carry out one more order? The answer is not cowardice. The senators of Rome were not cowards. Many of them had demonstrated personal courage in military campaigns and legal battles that required genuine risk. The answer is architectural. It is built into the structure of the system that Augustus had created nearly 2 centuries earlier when he ended the Republic and invented what historians call the Principate. Augustus had understood that Romans would not accept a king. They had killed kings. They had constructed their entire national identity around the memory of expelling the last king of Rome and the principle that no single man should hold that kind of power. So Augustus had been careful with language. He had not called himself a king. He had called himself the first citizen, the princeps, the man who held power not by right of birth, but because the Senate and the Roman people had, through a series of carefully arranged constitutional procedures, granted him various offices and authorities that when combined amounted to something indistinguishable from absolute power, but was technically a collection of republican offices held simultaneously. This architecture worked brilliantly for 2 centuries. It also contained a flaw that Augustus either did not see or chose not to address. There was no mechanism within it for removing a living emperor. The Senate could theoretically vote to strip an emperor of his offices and declare him an enemy of the state. But the Praetorian Guard, the 10,000-man force encamped just outside Rome, existed specifically to protect the emperor's person, and their salaries and institutional identity were tied directly to the continuation of imperial rule. For the Senate to act against Commodus, it would need either the cooperation of the Praetorian Guard or sufficient military force to overcome it. The military forces capable of that were stationed on the frontiers under generals who were not present in Rome and whose own survival depended on not making themselves visible targets. The failed assassination of 182 had demonstrated something additional. The guards were fast. Any individual attempt on Commodus's life was likely to fail, and any failure would be followed immediately by a purge that extended far beyond the person who had tried. The cost of failure was not personal death. It was the destruction of every household, every family connection, every network attached to the person who had made the attempt. This is why the senators chanted, not because they lacked the character to resist, but because they had performed the calculation accurately and understood that the odds of successful resistance through any available mechanism were poor enough that rational people did not attempt it. Cassius Dio was sitting in the tribune on the afternoon that Commodus killed an ostrich. It was during one of the arena spectacles. Commodus raised his bow and shot the bird, cutting its head cleanly from its body. The long neck swayed. The blood was still moving. He reached down, picked up the severed head, and walked toward the section of stands where the senators were seated. One by one he moved along the row, holding the bleeding head inches from their faces. He said nothing. He looked at each man in turn, slowly, with the particular attention of someone searching for something specific. In a face, a flicker of the wrong emotion, a moment of genuine response, any sign of disgust or horror, or the contempt he knew was there underneath the performance of devotion he had been extracting from these men for years. Cassius Dio was in that row. He recorded in his history what he felt in his body during that moment. Something was rising in him that he could not control, something that was simultaneously laughter and horror, and the particular despair of a man watching the world become something he cannot describe in any language that would be believed. He tore a piece of laurel from his wreath and pushed it into his mouth and chewed it with focused intensity, because the physical act of grinding something between his teeth gave his face an expression that was neither the right response nor the wrong one. It was just a man chewing something. He survived that afternoon. He went home. He sat down. He wrote it down. That is how we know the public performance of the arena was one face of what was happening. The interior of the palace was another. The scriptores, historiae Augustae, drawing on sources closer to the events records, the daily reality inside the imperial household, with a clinical precision that reads across the centuries more like documentation than narrative. Commodus bathed 8 times a day. He ate his meals in the water, surrounded by the people who existed to serve whatever purpose he assigned them on a given afternoon. He walked into the sacred temples of Rome, carrying on his person the accumulated evidence of the previous night, and the word the historian uses is defiled. He entered the temples defiled with excess in human blood. He had obtained surgical instruments, the kind Roman physicians used, and he used them on people in his household. Not on enemies, not on prisoners. On people who belonged to him in the legal sense that Roman law provided, and who therefore had no recourse to any authority that might intervene. He cut into them and watched the blood with the focused interest of a man engaged in genuine inquiry. The scriptores record that some of these people died during these sessions. He called it practicing medicine. His wife Brutia Crispina had survived 10 years beside him. A decade of watching other women arrive at the palace and disappear from it. A decade of performing the required emotional responses at the required moments while maintaining the silence that was the only thing keeping her alive. Then one morning, with no witnesses produced and no trial conducted and no defense permitted, he accused her of adultery. The accusation functioned as the verdict. She was sent to Capri, the same island where Lucilla had died. The same outcome. He destroyed the entire Quintilia family. Men who had been among the most distinguished military commanders of the previous reign, their families, their households. The name was removed from the records wherever it could be reached. His cousin Vitracia Faustina was executed. Men who merely resembled a fugitive he was pursuing were killed because they had the wrong face in the wrong city at the wrong time. The system of execution had achieved its own momentum. It no longer required individual decisions. It required only that names be compiled and that the Praetorian Guard continue to function as the mechanism it had been designed to be. The heads appeared on pikes along the roads leading into Rome. The bodies went into the Tiber. The city watched and said nothing because the city had learned over 12 years that silence was the only thing that kept a name off a list. Latus watched this from his position as Praetorian prefect and performed the same calculation that every rational person in Rome had performed and arrived at the same conclusion. There was no external solution. No army was going to arrive from the frontiers. No senator was going to stand in the Curia and deliver the speech that ended the reign. If anything was going to change, it was going to have to change from inside this building by the hands of people who woke up here every morning, and it was going to have to be planned with enough precision that failure was not survivable as an outcome to plan for. He kept this thought to himself. Eclectus managed the emperor's household and had stood in rooms where decisions were made and carried messages that changed the lives of the people who received them. He had watched what happened to the people on the lists. He had been present at enough of it to have reached years ago a point where he could no longer construct a justification for his continued participation that he found convincing. He had continued anyway because the alternative was not resignation. The alternative was the list. He kept this to himself also. Marcia knew about both of them. She had spent 10 years watching people in this palace, and she had developed a particular sensitivity to the specific quality of stillness that a person displays when they are waiting for something and have not yet found the conditions that make it possible to act. She recognized it in Latus. She recognized it in Eclectus. She recognized it because she had been carrying it herself for years. She had also been watching Narcissus. In those morning training sessions, she had noticed the change that had occurred in him over the years of his service in the palace. The quality she had identified early as careful calculation had deepened into something more settled, more resolved. There had been incidents in those practice chambers that she had observed from the periphery and that Narcissus had observed from the center, incidents in which the emperor's behavior had crossed lines that the other people present responded to by looking away. Narcissus had not looked away. He had watched with the expression of a man committing something to permanent memory, and then he had continued the session, and afterward he had been very quiet. She understood what he had seen. She understood what he was waiting for. She did not yet know if she would ever need to ask him for anything. She filed the observation where she kept the other things that might one day matter. In 192 AD, Commodus announced that the city of Rome would be renamed. The new name was Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. He renamed the Senate after himself. He renamed all 12 months of the year, each one carrying one of his names or titles. He had already replaced the head of the 100-foot Colossus of Nero, the giant statue that stood at the entrance to the Colosseum, with his own likeness rendered as Hercules, the demigod he believed he had been reincarnated to embody. The Senate voted to accept all of it. Marcia was in a corridor of the palace when she learned the result. She did not change her expression. She had not shown a genuine expression in this building in years. But in the part of her mind where the map lived, the map she had been building since her first weeks in this place, something settled into position with a finality she recognized. There was no one coming. No force outside this building was going to correct what was happening inside it. The Senate had renamed itself on the instructions of a man they understood was destroying the empire they served, and they had done it without visible resistance because the alternative was visible, and the visible alternative was a name on a list and a guard arriving in the night. If anything was going to happen, it was going to happen here, in these rooms. By people who slept in this building and woke up in it every morning and had each of them reached the point where the risk of continuing was beginning to look comparable to the risk of acting. On the 31st of December 192 AD, Commodus announced his plans for the following day with the enthusiasm of a man who has finally arrived at the conclusion he has been working toward for years. On the 1st of January 193 AD, he was not going to emerge from the imperial palace as Emperor of Rome to conduct the traditional ceremonies of the new year. He was going to emerge from the barracks of the gladiatorial school. He was going to walk out of the gladiator's quarters dressed as a gladiator, and from that moment the distinction between the ruler of the known world and a professional arena fighter would be officially, ceremonially, and permanently dissolved. He bathed that evening with the contentment of a man who has finally gotten everything right. A child named Commodus found a tablet on a table. It had been left there with the carelessness of a person who no longer believes anything in the world can threaten them. The boy could not read. He brought it to the woman who was always nearby, who always seemed to understand what things meant. Marcia read it. Her name was first, then Latus, then Eclectus. The executions were scheduled for the following morning before the New Year's ceremonies. She stood in the corridor and held the tablet and was still. In those minutes, she did not think about what to do next. She had known what to do next for years. What she did in those minutes was review the full length of the decades she had spent in this building. The boy by the bath, the lambskins in the furnace, and the lesson they had taught not about the boy's cruelty, but about the system that had formed around the cruelty and protected it from consequence. Marcus Aurelius writing the Meditations at a military camp on the Danube, and knowing in the private place where a person knows things they cannot say aloud that his son was going to be catastrophic, and choosing the stability of the succession over the safety of the empire. Lucilla going to the Colosseum with a plan, and a man who had needed the moment to mean something and what it had cost her. The senators in the front rows with their mouths moving and their faces performing, Cassius Dio chewing a laurel leaf with focused desperation, Perennis running an empire while the emperor played at divinity and then dying for it. The look on Narcissus's face during certain moments in the practice chambers, the look of a man who has seen enough and is waiting for an exit that does not require him to simply disappear. 10 years of preparation for a night exactly like this one. She found Latus first. She showed him the tablet. He read his name. He looked at it for a long moment with the attention of a man confirming something he has already understood and needed to see written down to make it real. Then he looked at her. He had spent years assessing situations. The current situation was not complicated. The list was real. The executions were scheduled for morning. Commodus had just announced a plan that represented the final formal abandonment of any pretense of governance. The empire's borders were holding by inertia. The treasury had no margin. The grain supply was fragile. If this man was still alive tomorrow afternoon, the question of who would be Praetorian prefect would be answered by the same mechanism that answered every question in this palace. If he said yes tonight and the plan worked, there was a chance of something. A real emperor. A functional administration. Rome as a thing worth governing. He said yes. Eclectus read his name on the tablet and was quiet for a moment. He had delivered too many messages to too many households and watched too many times what happened after he knocked on the door and handed over the document he was carrying. He had reached his limit years ago. He had continued past it because the limit in this place was not a door you could walk through and find yourself somewhere else. It was just a place you stood and kept going. His name was on the list now, regardless. The calculation had resolved itself into simplicity. He said yes. The plan was clean because clean plans are the ones that survive contact with reality. Commodus had one habit that was absolutely consistent, the single most predictable element of his daily existence. After his bath each evening, without exception, he drank. The cup was always the same. The hands that prepared and delivered it were always the same. He had performed this ritual 1,000 times without varying it because he did not notice things that were consistent. Consistency was below the threshold of his attention. What he noticed was disruption, deviation. Anything that suggested the world was not arranging itself as expected. The cup was consistent. The hands were consistent. The woman who carried it had been consistent for 10 years. He had never once looked at it with suspicion. The thought had not occurred to him that there was anything in that direction to be suspicious of, because suspicion in that direction would have required him to entertain the possibility that someone in his immediate vicinity had both the capability and the will to act against him. And he had spent 12 years systematically eliminating everyone who might have had that combination. He had been very nearly thorough. Marcia prepared the wine. The historical sources do not record what she felt. They record what she did. She took the cup. She added what she had kept hidden through all the years of preparation. She arranged her face into the expression it had worn for a decade in this building. She walked to the bath chamber. He stepped out of the water in good spirits, warm from the bath and animated by the anticipation of the morning. He reached for the cup the way he had reached for it 1,000 times without looking at it or at her, because both of them were simply there, part of the reliable landscape of his evenings. He drank. The poison required minutes to begin its work, and the body that received it was not an ordinary one. 12 years of daily arena training of physical conditioning that had genuinely been rigorous, even if the combat itself was theatrical, had built a constitution that pushed back hard against what was entering the bloodstream. Within minutes, the color drained from his face. His stomach contracted. He was on the floor, his body attempting to expel what it had received, fighting back with the stubbornness of a machine that had been built very well over a very long time. But it was not enough to finish it. He was convulsing, but he was not dying. And the understanding of what that meant landed on Marcia with the physical weight of cold water. If this man was alive at sunrise, the response would have no boundaries. Not just the three of them. Everyone they had spoken to in the past year. Everyone whose name any of them could be made to produce. Every guard who had been reassigned tonight. Every servant who had been nearby and said nothing. She sent word to Narcissus. She told him what had happened. She told him what was required. She offered him a sum of money that was larger than he had ever held in his life or expected to hold. But she also told him something else. She told him that his name, although not yet on tonight's list, would appear on a future one, because she had watched the pattern long enough to know that the circle of suspicion always contracted eventually, and that men who spent years in daily proximity to the emperor and had seen what he had seen in those practice chambers were not people the paranoia would indefinitely overlook. Narcissus had been waiting for an honest conversation about his situation for a long time. He accepted. Latus had already moved through the palace reassigning guards. The corridors were quiet, with the specific silence of a place where the people who are awake are performing sleep. The sounds of the buildings settling, the faint presence of the city beyond the walls, the distant movement of the few servants still at their tasks, surrounded the moment the way ordinary life always surrounds moments that history will later identify as turning points. Narcissus walked through the corridors he had walked through every morning for years. He had navigated this building's human geography as skillfully as he had navigated the physical layout. He had learned which rooms to avoid at which hours and which expressions to wear in the presence of which people. He had become, through years of careful practice, essentially invisible in the place where the most visible man in the world lived. He opened the door. The most powerful man in the world was on the floor of his own bath chamber. The marble was cold. The muscles that had performed in the arena before 50,000 spectators were refusing to respond to the signals being sent to them. He looked up. His eyes were open. There was recognition in them. The specific recognition of a man whose body is failing, but whose mind has not yet stopped working, who understands the geometry of what is happening, even as his capacity to respond to it drains away. He tried to grab Narcissus's wrists. His hands found the forearms and could not close. The grip that had been strong enough to kill animals in the arena, that had held real weapons against men who had been designed to lose, and had made the performances look convincing enough that 50,000 people had believed them, could not form a fist around the wrists of his own trainer. Narcissus wrapped his hands around the emperor's throat. The man who had renamed Rome after himself could not call out for the city he had renamed. The man who had replaced the face of the Colossus with his own could not call for the guards stationed outside the door of the room that housed his own face. The man who had forced the Senate of Rome, the collective body of the most powerful administrators in the known world, to stand in the front rows of the Colosseum and scream his praises 700 times could not produce a sound. The man who had dressed as Hercules and beaten defenseless people to death in front of crowds and called it proof of divinity was being killed by his training partner in his own room, on his own floor, on the last night of the year, while the empire he had governed maintained the silence it had practiced for a decade. It lasted seconds. Commodus died on the 31st of December, 192 AD. He was 31 years old. The man who had believed with complete sincerity that he was the reincarnation of a demigod died the way every man dies, powerless on a cold surface in a room with no audience. The last face he saw was hers. The Senate convened the following morning, and the response was recorded by Cassius Dio with a precision that reads at this distance in time like the controlled exhale of his body that has been holding its breath for 12 years. The decree was comprehensive. Cast the gladiator into the burial pit. He who killed senators must be dragged with the hook. Every statue destroyed, every image removed, every plaque taken down, every month restored to its original name, every institution renamed back to what it had been called before one man decided that his name was a sufficient replacement for 2 centuries of Roman history. Rome became Rome again. In a single session of the Senate, the formal architecture of the performance was dismantled. But the machine that had built Commodus did not stop with him. His successor was Pertinax, a general who had served Marcus Aurelius, a man who understood exactly what Rome needed and began implementing it immediately. He reduced the extravagance of the imperial household. He stopped the arena performances. He began the work of rebuilding the treasury and the administrative capacity that had been gutted over 12 years of deliberate neglect. He lasted 86 days. The Praetorian Guard killed him. The reason was money. Pertinax had declined to pay the donative, the cash bonus that new emperors traditionally distributed to the Guard upon taking power. He had declined because the treasury could not sustain it, and because he believed with the optimism of a man who had not yet fully understood what he was dealing with, that the Guard would respect fiscal necessity. The Guard did not respect fiscal necessity. The Guard respected money because money was the only thing that had ever actually purchased their loyalty. And when the money was withheld, the loyalty that had never been anything other than purchased evaporated instantly. What happened after Pertinax died is not a metaphor. It is not a rhetorical device employed to make a point about institutional corruption. It is a documented historical event. The Praetorian Guard sent word through the city of Rome that the position of emperor was available to the highest bidder. 2 men bid. One of them, a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus, offered more. He was declared emperor of Rome. He had purchased the most powerful political office in the Western world in an open auction conducted by his own future bodyguard in the same week that those same men had killed his predecessor for not paying them what they wanted. He lasted 66 days before he too was executed. 5 emperors in 12 months. The borders held barely by the inertia of military structures that had been built well enough to persist through chaos. The grain moved with difficulty. The roads remained passable. The empire survived because institutions of sufficient scale carry a momentum that outlasts individual catastrophes. But the damage done in those 12 years, the depletion of the treasury, the erosion of administrative capacity, the destruction of the experienced men who had been killed or driven into permanent silence, that damage did not repair itself when Commodus died. The 3rd century that followed would bring the empire to the edge of complete dissolution. The machine that built Commodus outlasted him by centuries. It went on producing the conditions that made men like him possible. The concentration of unchecked power in a single person. The absence of any legitimate mechanism for removing that person when the person was catastrophic. The culture that develops around concentrated power in which silence becomes a universal currency, and every person who might have acted against the catastrophe has already calculated that the cost of trying is higher than the cost of enduring. None of that died on the 31st of December, 192 AD. Marcia was executed in 193 AD. Septimius Severus, who emerged from the chaos of the year of 5 emperors to establish the dynasty that followed, had no institutional interest in the continued existence of the woman who had killed his predecessor. She had, from the perspective of the new regime, served a function that was now complete. Rome moved on. She received no statue. Her name was not added to the official record of those who had served the state. The Historia Augusta notes her death in a single sentence and continues to the next subject. What she left behind was the plain fact of what she had done, preserved in the records of men like Cassius Dio, who understood that some things need to be written down even when writing them down is dangerous because the alternative is that the world forgets they happened. For 12 years, an empire of 60 million people with the most powerful military force in the world, in a Senate composed of the most capable administrators in history, had been unable to stop one man from destroying the institution they had all spent their lives serving. The generals could not stop him. The senators could not stop him. The Praetorian Guard, the 10,000-man force whose entire purpose was the maintenance of imperial order, could not stop him because its loyalty had always been purchased rather than principled, and its self-interest ran toward continuation rather than correction. A woman with no title and no army and no official standing and her name written at the top of an execution list stopped him with a cup of wine and 10 years of preparation and a decision made in a palace corridor in the 15 minutes available to her. Commodus believed he was permanent. He believed that the strength he had built in the arena and the devotion he had extracted from the Senate and the name he had imposed on Rome and on every month of the year added up to something that transcended the ordinary fragility of human existence. He believed that the world he had constructed, the world that bent to his expectations and reflected his image back in the form of 50,000 voices, was real in the way that permanent things are real. He died on the floor of his own bath chamber, strangled by his own trainer, poisoned by his own lover, unable to form a word, unable to summon the guards who were steps away, unable to do anything in his final seconds except understand that the world he had believed in had never existed outside his own conviction that it did. The empire that outlasted him endured for 3 more centuries in the West and more than a millennium in the East. It would produce men of genuine greatness and men of genuine catastrophe and everything between those poles. It would survive invasions and plagues and economic collapses and civil wars that would have destroyed lesser institutions. It persisted with the stubbornness of something that has survived long enough to believe in its own permanence. But the flaw remained: the absence of any legitimate mechanism for removing a ruler who had become a catastrophe, the gap in the architecture that Augustus had either not seen or chosen not to address. That gap stayed open. It would be filled again and again by the only mechanism that the system made available, by the people closest to the emperor, by the people who poured the wine. That is the real story of Commodus. Not the cruelty, though the cruelty was real and documented and worse than most people imagine before they read the primary sources. Not the madness, though the behavior the sources describe exceeds what most clinical frameworks would struggle to categorize. The real story is the machine, the institution that was sophisticated enough to govern the known world and not wise enough to build a door that could be opened from the inside when the person at the top became something the institution could not survive. Marcia understood the machine. She had lived inside it for 10 years and mapped every corridor of it, human and physical. She understood what it could do and what it could not do, and where the one gap was that the machine had left open by oversight or by design. She walked through it with a cup in her steady hands on the last night of the year. Rome built her no statue, but she deserves to be remembered.